Welcome to Mount Hope Cemetery. How many of you have visited us before? Okay. Anyone from out of town?
Oh, me.
Sometimes I make references to things that I don't want to have go over people's heads if you're not familiar with our city. Today's tour is I am a member of the Friends of Mount Hope Cemetery, and my partner here, Judy, is with the 1816 Farmington Meeting House, and we're also sponsored today by the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives Organization.
And AKWAABA.
And AKWAABA.
And AKWAABA will be bringing us a very special visitor at the end of the tour. Anna Marie Douglas is coming to greet us all. So we're delighted that you're all here. The Farmington Meeting House has as its mission thinking about equal rights for all people, past and present, especially African Americans, Indigenous people, and women, because that was the historic focus of people affiliated with that meeting house. We're in the middle of a big project to restore this building, to open it as an interpretive center, so stay tuned and we welcome you all to come and see. We're delighted to be working with Mount Hope Cemetery, and Sally's actually on the 1816 board too, so she's a crossover person. How many people here are on the 1816 Meeting House board? Thank you all especially for being here, and everyone else too, and I will turn it over to Sally.
Mount Hope Cemetery opened in 1838, and it is still owned by the city of Rochester. It's one of the few, or one of the first, municipally owned Victorian cemeteries in the nation. At that point, this was the edge of the city, where now, of course, it's become part of the city. So without further ado, we'll start moving. If people do have questions or additional comments to add, please feel free to do so. It makes it a lot more informative and fun for everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Let's go. Okay. So as many of you know, upstate New York was a real hotbed of progression and transition in terms of social causes, in terms of religion, and a lot of immigration coming to the United States. And it really crossed the lines of a lot of religious and moral beliefs. And one group we are going to be talking about predominantly today is the Quaker group, which is where the meeting house is being restored out in the Farmington area. And a lot of Quakers had beliefs that the Quaker religion believes that there's a little of God in all of us. And so they were very concerned with equality and abolition, women's rights eventually, and the rights of the Native American people. So in New York State, slavery was actually outlawed in 1827. And in 1799, there had been put in place what they called a gradual emancipation law. And this meant that it emancipated children of enslaved people who had been born before July 4th, 1799, but it indentured them until they were young adults. So basically, they were saying that these enslaved children would be freed when they became young adults. In 1817, a new law passed that would free the enslaved born before 1799, but that wouldn't take effect until 1827. So there were these iterations or hiccups, and finally, again, in 1827, the practice of enslaving human beings was outlawed in New York State. So in this area, there lies a man who he has no marker. A lot of our residents don't have markers, but he certainly made a mark on the abolition movement, and his name was John Morrison. And John Morrison was employed at a place called the Cataract Hotel at Niagara Falls. And so he is in our census as living on Vine Street, downtown by the Little Theater. And then in 1865, and then he was also the head waiter at the Cataract House. And a lot of people think of the Underground Railroad as a group of benevolent white people that were helping the enslaved and freedom seekers find their way. Well, there were certainly a lot of people of color also involved, and John Morrison was one of those people. He was listed on the African American census of Rochester. Yes, there was one, though I think he was actually half Native American. And he had registered for the draft out of Monroe County, though did not serve in a military capacity. However, what happened was a lot of Southerners, as they came to visit upstate New York and Niagara Falls, they would often bring along their servants and enslaved people. And some started to mention that the hotel employees regularly enticed the enslaved to run to Canada and freedom, because of course that was right across the river. Others claimed that hotel employees forcibly abducted and removed the Southerners' rightful property. Regardless, the workers were implicated in releasing slaves from bondage. And of course, Southern owners were not too fond of this practice. And there was this one clipping from a New Orleans newspaper that said, and I quote, "Proprietors of the Cataract House keep in their employ as servants a set of free Negroes, many of whom have wives and relatives in Canada. They have an organized plan of taking off all slaves that come into the house. The Misters Whitney, who were the owners, keep these fellows in their employ, knowing them to be engaged in this business. Therefore, it behooves all Southern people traveling north to avoid the Cataract House at the Falls of Niagara." So I don't know how many people actually read that. But John Morrison, there's actually a museum on the state side of Niagara Falls where they go into a lot of depth about him. He ferried some of these freedom seekers across the river himself. There's some great artistic paintings and depictions of this if you look for them. And when he died in 1869 at 50 years of age, I quote, "Mr. John Morrison, many years head waiter at the Cataract House, died at his residence in Rochester on the 21st last. Mr. Morrison was well known here and will be remembered by old habituals of the Cataract House, with whom he was a favorite. His death is lamented by a wide circle of friends who knew his private worth." And here he ended up buried in a cemetery with some of the most prominent and meaningful abolitionists that we saw in practice. A lot of people don't have markers here, either because of affordability, because weather. The one thing about being a municipally owned cemetery is all these records are in our offices. So if anyone's looking for a family member or a particular person, you can contact the office and they can tell you exactly where they're buried.
Was there any sort of border patrol? How easy was it for the average person to go back and forth between Canada and the U.S.?
I think across the river it was pretty simple. I mean, that hotel was right on the edge.
Or anything, you could just, yeah.
People were worried about customs duty, so if you had something to sell, they would be concerned because they wanted to get the duties for it. But for people, you got 25 cents. You took a little rowboat across the river at the base of the falls, which is what John Morrison rode, or you crossed on the suspension bridge and just walked across or took the train.
So we have several people to talk about at this site. First of all, the Posts, Isaac and Amy Post, and then also Rhoda DeGarmo and her husband, who are over there with the white polished stones that have been cleaned up in the last few years. That's the kind of work that our organization does, is to work on the preservation as well as the promotion of the great history that we have here. I mentioned the Quakers and the Society of Friends principles of simplicity, truth, equality, and community led many to become social activists, as I mentioned. Some ministers and elders of the Genesee Yearly Meeting of Friends, though they considered slavery to be evil, they disapproved of the activities of a lot of the abolitionist Quaker advocates. They felt that it was interfering with other people's property. And this led to a split because the radical Quakers claimed that the elders should not have the right to limit these activities of conscience that they felt were so important to promote. So in 1828, the Quakers split into two factions, the Hicksite and the Orthodox. And the Posts and the DeGarmos were neighbors of Daniel Anthony, Susan B. Anthony's father, and the Anthony family, where they had a farm in Gates. And they would often meet on a weekly basis and discuss various reform issues, including abolition of slavery. Rhoda, again, the white stones beyond us here, her early activism and women's rights resulted in her registering and voting with Susan B. Anthony, as did Amy Post, who we'll talk about in a moment. And in 1842, over 20 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, Rhoda joined the Western New York Anti-Slavery Society, which again we'll be hearing a lot about through several people we're visiting today. But what was interesting also is that the founders were not just Quakers. They were Presbyterians, Quakers, Baptists, and a whole group of different faith-based organizations. Rhoda also managed the first anti-slavery fair in 1843. The anti-slavery fairs were events where people would bring goods to sell. Particularly, they would encourage farmers to bring their goods, and then with the monies raised, they would donate that to the cause of abolition. And in fact, I have a clipping I found online. The first Western New York anti-slavery fair to be held at Rochester the 22nd of second month, 1843. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the undersigned, feeling that we cannot stand still at a mere announcement that we are abolitionists, we protest the iniquitous system of holding property in man, and we feel that the American people should be aroused to a sense of their guilt. And until we have individually proffered our aid to this great work, we could not just lay the flattering function to our souls that we had discharged our duty. And it went on in various 19th century language. But this was signed by several prominent abolitionists and pro-suffrage people, including Amy Post, Sarah Hallwell, who's buried at the other end of the cemetery, Sarah Fish, who's also buried at the cemetery, Mary Hallwell, Rhoda DeGarmo, and Phoebe Hathaway. So this was a innovation that they came up with to spread the word and get more people interested in the movement in general. Questions on that? Yes?
Did either Quaker sect, did one become more predominant over the other?
Well, I don't think it was over the other. In fact, when I lived out in Macedon, there was this story about this couple that the husband was Hicksite and the wife was Orthodox, and he'd drop her off at that meeting house and then go on to his own meeting house. But what we're calling the radical, the Hicksites, were much more involved in abolition.
Let's just say Quakers are pacifists.
Well, I was just wondering
so they would not end up shooting that one. They operate on consensus as well.
Yeah.
Which is the house that you're restoring? Which one sect is that of Quaker?
It was Hicksite, although until from 1816 to 28, it was everybody. And actually in Farmington, the Orthodox were very active abolitionists too. So it's sometimes not. Also in Rochester, there was active Orthodox as well as Hicksite people, in abolition.
Good question, though. So speaking of the Post, now some of you may be familiar, there's a plaque downtown next to the Hochstein Music School that acknowledges the Posts. That was where their home was. And they had moved to Rochester in 1836. They ended up leaving the Hicksite order in 1845. But Isaac had originally been married to Amy's sister, who passed away and left him and 2 children. And then he married Amy, so their children were in the kind of awkward position of having Amy be their aunt and their stepchild. But everybody seemed to get along fine. In 1845, Frederick Douglass and the Posts, Frederick Douglass stayed with the Posts when he was touring the area to decide if he was going to be settling here, long before he was popular. And they actually are noted as inspiring him to establish the anti-slavery newspaper in Rochester, the North Star, which we'll be mentioning more later. But Amy continued to be one of his closest friends and advisors. One thing I like to do is to quote from the historical documents, so that's why I'm carrying my notes today. And this is, I'm quoting Amy Post. A history of Rochester would hardly be complete without some reference to the wonderful Underground Railroad, which was kept in active operation as long as slavery of the Negro race continued. The secrecy of its construction, its marvelous origin, the great number of passengers, the amount of freight transported therein can never be told. All of its work was done in the dark. Although it had its depots, stations, passenger agents, and conductors in every state of the Union, daylight never shone upon it. Its stations had no electric lights, and the passengers no guide aside from that blessed light in the heavens known as the North Star. History furnishes nothing more replete with deeds of heroic daring than the bold, constant, and efficient help rendered to these fleeing fugitives by the colored men and women of this city. They were always ready for a fight for a fugitive slave, and if they failed to rescue one here, they would form a company of stalwart men and follow the party, spy out where they were stopping for the night, and generally finding the watchman asleep, they only failed once to return in triumph with their rescued brother or sister. So total hands-on moving people through this network. In 1849, Amy helped organize the first of the anti-slavery fairs, as I mentioned, and there's another quote that said at any time they would have up to, the Posts would have up to 12 runaways in their barn. She was also, as I said, active in the suffragist movement, and she signed the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls and helped plan the convention in Rochester that took place 2 weeks later, and did go to vote with Susan B. Anthony in 1872. All right, we're going to head this way and maybe get under some trees along the way.
How many people are buried here?
About shy of 400,000.
Wow.
And now, I'm glad you brought that up because it's a nice segue into what are we standing in front of. Now, instead of these great monuments, people prefer to be cremated, and this is a columbarium. So to accommodate this need, we're just answering questions about the that there's shy of 400,000 burials here at Mount Hope, and people, whereas they used to invest in these large monuments, and especially before there was the park system, people would come and have a picnic at their plot and that type of thing. Now funerary practices have changed again, and people are preferring cremation, and in response to that, we're building new repositories to hold their ashes. Now, when I first started giving tours at Mount Hope, I could not remember columbarium. And so here's my little tip for remembering. If you know somebody who died, columbarium. So this is all new, but who we're talking about here are these very nondescript graves of the Kedzie family. Specifically, John and Laura Kedzie. Kedzie was a silversmith who actually in 1854 developed the Kedzie water filter. And this made him very wealthy. And he owned a number of properties in Rochester that eventually, that were stops on the Underground Railroad. But he also managed to help the Douglasses secure their first home on Alexander Street, because he owned it, and it was difficult for people of color to get property, even though slavery was outlawed. So they were early opponents of slavery. They were openly critical of their Brick Presbyterian Church and the National Presbyterian Church for supporting slaveholders. So, of course, in 1842, they excommunicated them, and I don't know what their religious preference was from there. But again, they own many properties in the city, on Ford Street, on Alexander, on North Washington Street, and I just want to read a little bit from the advertisement for the Kedzie water filter that made him so wealthy. The Kedzie improved water filter is one of the greatest and most useful inventions of the age, so perfect in its internal arrangements that every person having them is assured of pure, healthy water. And also know to a certainty that they are taking into the stomach no sort or kind of larvae or spawn of worms or insects or strange loathsome animalcule or impure floating matter that often can lay foundation to disease. Now, wouldn't you want to buy one? So, but again, he's noteworthy for us for helping the Douglases find their first home here in Rochester. So another aspect of the cemetery here that you may see if you wander around is the concept of an institutional plot. And this is where an organization, anyone from the University of Rochester to a synagogue, the concept is that people were affiliated with that group and are now buried together at a plot. So, Mount Hope was never a segregated cemetery, even though, for example, when you see some of the synagogue plots, there's a lot of German writing on the stones. Nobody was saying all the Germans had to be buried over here. It was purely non-segregated. But this particular area here, we have a group called the United Sons of Rochester, which was a, quote, colored association formed in the 1840s to achieve voting rights for blacks and also put together an institutional plot. And the young man that we'll talk about here is David Wyckoff, who was a veteran in the Civil War, African American. Anybody have a reaction to the fact that he was a veteran and black?
Would have been later in the war.
Nope, he could pass for white.
Oh.
And so he wanted to serve. He volunteered for the Army. I believe he was 17 years old, 18 years old, but he could pass for white. And so he was able to join the Union Army. He attended an all-white high school in Rochester as a white person, graduating in 1861. And sadly died at the age of 22 of consumption, having been promoted several times within the military in that 3 or 4 year span that he was affiliated. His father, who was in an unmarked grave next to him, he was also the president of the Colored Citizens of the City of Rochester. And in 1846, he gave a speech where he said, "We ask that we, natives of this country who neither wish nor expect to live in any other country, should also have equality of civil and political rights conferred on us. Confer us these rights, and we trust that you will find us worthy of them." So again, there was a lot of activism in Rochester in the 1840s around these causes.
Wyckoff was half German and he spoke fluent German as well as English.
He did.
Yes.
Which is probably one of the reasons he was so light.
What was the question?
He was half German and spoke fluent German. As a matter of fact, I do have noted here, he, at his graduation from high school, he gave a 10-minute speech in German.
And what was his name?
David Wyckoff. David, hold on, there's a middle initial. E. Yep. Oh yeah, not as if there's a monument behind me. But his father was David W. So we're going to proceed up this hill here and go on to our next stop. So I'll talk about a couple people who are kind of off the path, so we're not going to have a chance to visit them today. But one of them, his name was Lindley Murray Moore, and he actually married the sister-in-law of the women's rights activist Lucretia Mott. And in 1836, at the Farmington Quarterly Meeting, which is the meeting house we've been talking about. He was the clerk for the men's meeting, and his wife was the clerk for the women's meeting. And in fellowship, they published a strong abolitionist statement pamphlet titled An Address from Farmington Quarterly Meeting of Friends to its members on slavery. So again, promoting these ideas of abolition amongst the Quaker faith. In 1838, he helped form the Anti-Slavery Society and was its first president. And then, in a side note, his son became a very prominent physician, Edward Mottmore, and also is remembered as the father of the Rochester Public Park System. So, you know, this is the way history goes. There's always lots of tangents and things that we can go off on, but I did think that was interesting that he was affiliated specifically with the Farmington Meeting House that we've been talking about today.
Does he have a headstone?
Yes, it's like
in
all
there.
around the corner, and there's a whole
Yes.
more plot. And we'll have this way. So this is a really good standpoint to talk about two families. First of all, looking up there on the hill, and there's actually people at the gravesite, there's a large obelisk. And that is the plot of Myron Holley. And Myron Holley founded the Liberty Party, which the primary platform was the abolition of slavery, and that their first convention was held out in Macedon, New York. Professionally, he had come from Connecticut. He was a lawyer. He left the law profession once he realized he may have to defend people that he actually thought were guilty. But then he went on to supervise the building of the western half of the Erie Canal. Now, these days, we drive this, right? You can drive from Rochester to Syracuse to Buffalo and pretty much the path of the canal. But in those days, supervising this was all on horseback. The men were paid by cash, so he was often riding through this wilderness with bags of cash. In fact, at one point, someone accused him of misallocating funds, but eventually that was cleared. After that, he supervised the western half of the Erie Canal, and he made sure that it flowed through downtown Rochester. Because of that diversion, the city and products were open to the west. And that's how Rochester became one of the first boom towns with the business that brought it. And now people will often complain that the thruway doesn't pass through Rochester. You can go through Syracuse, you can go right into Buffalo. But somehow when they did the thruway, they missed Rochester. And it's just an interesting fact in terms of that kind of commerce and traffic. So for 8 years, he traveled the 363 miles of the route on horseback, in wagons, and on foot. In 1840, founded the abolitionist Liberty Party, and he published a newspaper called the Rochester Freeman. That obelisk monument was paid for by pennies that were contributed by the party. When he died, 6,000 people attended the dedication of that monument, the largest gathering of living people in this cemetery. His daughter Sally is also buried there, and she, as she grew up, she went down to Virginia and started some schools to educate these recently freed children who, up to that point, had not been allowed to learn to read or write. And then I know someone's going to ask it. So in 1850, the new village 4 miles west of Brockport, Erie Canal, was named Holley in his honor.
Here's a relate to Palmyra and the canal. I've done a little history. I bicycle a lot, and as you know, you can bike along the canal. Palmyra was bigger than Rochester when it was first developed, and because of the canal, there were a lot of African Americans in Palmyra, and they could get actual paying jobs, which was quite rare at the time.
Yeah.
Barbers was actually a big profession for black men.
Well, we find that also with funeral directors, because, well, for a number of issues. First, trust of someone taking care of your deceased loved one. the cosmetology, how you fix the person for a wake. It's just a really interesting route that, again, the African American community was serving itself. And still, like here in Rochester with the Latimer Funeral Home, these have gone on for decades. So the other family that I'd like, and thank you for that. The other family I'd like to talk about is up on the hill, these very uniform round stones, and that is the Porter family. And the Porter family had several very prominent abolitionist activists, beginning with Samuel Porter and his wife. Their home was a stop on the Underground Railroad. He was an early president of the Western New York Anti-Slavery Society, and he would help Frederick Douglass load the boats down on the Genesee River to transport the freedom seekers to Canada. We'll talk also in a bit about the Tallman building, which is downtown, and that also had kind of a waterway next to it that could be loaded up and ship people down to the river. Samuel Porter's son, Samuel D. Porter, and his wife were also anti-slavery activists. Samuel, the son, owned a bookstore and a real estate agency, and they were all, not surprisingly, members of the Liberty Political Party. They founded a Bethel Free Church. They were dear friends of Frederick Douglass and a key part of the local underground network. Susan Porter actually also started a group that founded the Rochester Orphan Asylum, which, when you trace it down to today, actually founded the Hillside Children's the agencies. Now, Mariah, who is the sister of Samuel D., she owned a boarding house, which was ideal for moving people through the city. And she harbored a lot of fleeing slaves at her home, or at her boarding house. And when she died, the Rochester Herald obituary said, "Only a few weeks before her death, an aged black woman named Harriet Tubman, who used to be a professional smuggler of slaves from the South, called upon Miss Porter and recalled the time when she used to stop at her house with fugitives in charge. Sometimes Mariah would have as many as 10 or 12 of these unfortunates hidden in her house." So again, very active and key people in that network. The last thing I'll mention about the Porters, Frederick Douglass had a daughter, Annie, who we'll be meeting later, and she died at the age of 10 when Frederick was over in Europe. The Porters actually buried Annie in their family plot until Frederick could come back and secure their own plot that they have here. And again, if anyone else has more comments to that, please feel free. Yes, yep. And then just recently, thanks to some people here, we're able to add monuments to the plot that recognize the little girl and her mother, Anna, who was the mother of all his children, Frederick Douglass's children, and was married over 40 years. All right, we are going to head out this way again and just around the corner. Okay, so here, it's kind of precarious to get up to the top of that hill. There is actually a stairway around the corner, and there's a shorter stairway here, but it's easier to talk from here because I have quite a lot to share with you at this stop. The grave site that I'm talking about is that of Horace McGuire. And Horace McGuire was a typesetter at the newspaper offices in the Tallman building working on the North Star publication. And as a gift to us, in 1913, he prepared a paper for the Rochester Historical Society that detailed his experiences working on the North Star and some of the company that came to visit Frederick Douglass. And so I'm going to be quoting a bit from that now. First of all, the North Star was published out of the Tallman building. It originally was published out of the basement of the AME Zion Church, but we'll get into that in a moment. So John Tallman is also buried here at Mount Hope. And the building, the Tallman building, still stands on Main Street, Main and Aqueduct Streets in downtown Rochester. So it's across from the Reynolds Arcade near State Street. 25 East Main, thank you. And Tallman was also a big abolitionist, which is why, he was certainly aware of what was, that the North Star was being published there. He also had an abolitionist reading room there. He'd been known to have social gatherings for different abolitionist groups. So he was also actively involved, though we won't be visiting him today. But to quote from Horace McGuire, he said, "I became conversant with the locations of the stations of the so-called Underground Railroad. The house of Mr. Douglas on South Avenue was a principal station here. Trusted men and women did not hesitate to open their houses and secret these fugitives from slavery. Among the friends in Rochester were Isaac Post, William Hollowell, and Sam Porter." And we talked about Post and Porter. William Hollowell is actually buried at the far end here as well. Continuing the quote, "At night, these black people were taken on their way to Charlotte or Oswego or Lewiston, going as far as possible during the darkness and stopping at daylight to be again secreted in the houses or barns of men known to be of the abolition party. It is related that a family of 5 persons, colored fugitives, were hidden in the barn of Mr. Samuel D. Porter on the corner of Fitzhugh and Spring Streets. The officers had done a thorough search of Mr. Porter's house and barn, but had failed to look under the hay." Horace also witnessed the meeting of Frederick Douglass with John Brown. John Brown was planning the Harper's Ferry raid. Is everyone familiar with Harper's Ferry? Because sometimes they're not anymore. And so John Brown had come to Rochester and upstate New York to convince Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass to help him in this project, to initiate a slave revolt in the southern states by taking over the arsenal. So Brown had met both Tubman and Douglass in his years in Massachusetts. Tubman actually did help to plan and recruit for the raid, but Douglass declined, believing that Brown's plan was suicidal. Brown's party of 22 was defeated by a company of U.S. Marines. Several of those present at the raid would later be involved in the Civil War. Colonel Robert E. Lee was in overall command of the operation to retake the arsenal, something I didn't know until I was researching this. Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart were part of the troops guarding the arrested Brown once he'd been arrested. And fun fact, John Wilkes Booth and Walt Whitman were spectators at John Brown's execution. I don't know why there's a slide version of this presentation and I have all their pictures on a slide, and it's like, I never thought I'd see all these faces together. Anyway, Brown was charged with treason, and unfortunately, some letters that had been exchanged between Douglass and Brown were found, and so people started thinking that Douglass had something to do with the raid. And in response to that, he went to England. And the other things about this is, it was extensively covered in the press nationwide. This was the first national crisis to be publicized using the new electrical telegraph, which of course also was the Western Union was founded bringing together all these little telegraph companies. So I'm going back to the quote. "When Mr. Douglass came in, the greeting between the white man and the former slave was very cordial. They had been friends for years. These 2 men talked freely, and I recall only enough of the conversation to have been convinced in the most earnest terms Mr. Douglass entreated his friend to abandon this project. This was several months prior to October 1859, when this same white man, John Brown, was arrested and put to death for his ill-advised raid at Harper's Ferry." So you have Brown in Virginia.
that he's interred right outside of Lake Placid, and they have a museum there in North Elba, which is Lake Placid is part of North Elba.
And that's a whole other story, because John Brown and William Garrison and some other people were basically trying to provide farms and farmland for formerly enslaved people to move to upstate New York. And I think there was probably a climate difference there. But the community they were trying to form was called Timbuktu. And not to get too off course from the Underground Railroad, if you're interested in that, it is the John Brown Farm is up there. It's a national park site. There's a ranger there that shows you around, and there's a really nice exhibit in one of the barns about Timbuktu and how that was planned and how it did not ultimately succeed.
Charles Lenhart has done some interesting research on Frederick Douglass being in Philadelphia at the time that John Brown was apprehended, and the telegraph message came through for the sheriff of Philadelphia to arrest Douglass, but the telegraph operator, instead of delivering it to the sheriff, alerted Douglass, and that's how he knew that he had to leave to Europe.
Yeah, there's a couple versions of that story. Another version says that Henry Selden was on a train coming to Rochester, and he alerted Douglass and actually loaned Douglass the horse to get to Charlotte. So there's a couple iterations. I have not 100% verified what that.
Out to Niagara Falls. And it was John Hearn in Philadelphia who was a Quaker affiliated with the 1816 Meeting House.
Okay. It's amazing.
I meant to use his name, yes, you're right.
Okay, we are going to proceed up here and to the Douglass site. Oh, yes, sir.
Do the letters between Douglass and Brown still exist?
I don't think so. I don't know.
Frederick Douglass's writing in general, is there still a lot of his writing around?
Yeah, yep. And there's various organizations and universities. If you start searching online, you can find a lot.
What about original North Star papers? Are there any of those?
Yeah. Yep. And then eventually he renamed the paper Frederick Douglass's paper. I don't know where these people are going.
Did we lose Erica? She could have probably answered a lot of those.
No, she's right there.
I was gonna say, she probably knows. Do you know the answers to some of those questions? Yeah, I was gonna say.
But I don't want to disrupt anything, but yes, I do know a lot of this stuff. But the one thing that I will only add, and that is about the Tallman building and Tallman having the reading room, the anti-slavery reading room. Actually, that was actually run by a woman by the name of Harriet Jacobs, who happened to be a I don't like to say runaway slave, but I like to say freedom seeker. So she was somebody who came from North Carolina. She was enslaved for a number of years, and Douglass helped her, and she had the anti-slavery reading room in the Tallman building right above his office at the North Star.
And she stayed with the Posts originally.
Very good friends. She actually published a book, and Amy Post really helped her do that as well.
Can you say slave girl, where
Yes.
she lived in that roof for a while?
Yeah.
Okay. I wondered if she. So, can you just answer if his papers still exist, and are they local?
Lots of Frederick Douglass's papers still do exist, but as Sally was mentioning, they are in various places. So the Library of Congress definitely has some digitized, even undigitized things. So I would encourage anybody to go there. That's a treasure trove. And then you just got to know what to ask for. And then of course the University of Rochester, so the Frederick Douglass Institute, RIT, I know has letters that transpire between the Posts and Frederick. So you just got to do your digging. But Rochester is really a treasure trove of that information. So a lot of the institutions around here have all of that.
And Yale University recently received a gigantic gift from an Atlanta lifelong collector, which includes the manuscript of Frederick Douglass's July 5th speech.
Oh, wow. Oh, what's the slave is your fourth of July? Oh, wow. That would be amazing.
David Blight that was the negotiator for that. David Blight dedicated his biography of Douglass to.
Okay, let's proceed, and we have a special visitor.
I am am so honored that you request my presence here today. And as I entered, many memories came back. One of the memories that returned was our first home that we bought for Alexander. When we moved here, I must admit, moving to Rochester was not something that I wanted to do. Frederick would tell you that. I had many friends in Lynn. I was part of the Anti-Slavery Society, and my friends would come and help me do my errands just so I would be able to attend the meeting. And I also donated money from what I earned binding shoes and things. So, but I must say Rochester is our home, and we will always think of it as home. And I have grown to love Rochester. Now, our first home we bought, it was 9 rooms, and I was so pleased after living in that tenement house when we first got here. So I was very pleased, and the children in the neighborhood would come in the yard and listen to Frederick play the violin, and I had my garden, and I was just very pleased. And we started entertaining guests. And the one thing I must not forget to tell you is that me and Frederick, we're partners. Partners in the struggle. See, folks don't know that. And our partnership started when we first met. Frederick's job is to go and make the speeches and tell folks about the evils of slavery. And my job, well, my job is to manage the house, raise the children, and entertain our guests when they arrived, and also provide for the freedom seekers. Yes. Now, I must just say that many of our guests will come and stay for weeks. Some of our guests would stay for years. But I was always very, very polite to them. Now, Frederick always made the speeches, and as our family began to grow, we decided we need a larger place. So we moved to the farm on South Avenue. Much room. It was like 2 extra rooms for the freedom seekers. And so Frederick would come, and my job, whenever Harriet brought the freedom seekers to the house, I had to make sure that they had bandages and food and clothes and all of that. And now one of our guests was John Brown. Now when we left Alexander, our little one Annie had been born, and she was so fond of John Brown. I must say, you know, they had such a wonderful relationship. And as you know, I did not travel very much with Frederick, but there was this one time that we did go to Syracuse, and to my surprise, my friends from Lynn, they were there. And Reverend Samuel May had a reception in our honor. What a surprise. And my heart was just so full. And I will get back to John Brown when he tried to get Frederick to be a part of his raid. And Frederick said, as I told you, his job was to make the speeches and tell the folks and raise money. And so he told John Brown that was what his job was, and he would not help him. But as you know, John Brown was hung. And our little one Annie, because of the relationship she had with him, oh, she was devastated. She was already in much pain when it came because her father had to leave, because the authorities was going to come and get him. So he had to leave, and all of us, we were so afraid, because, you know, some of the questions we asked was, would he make it? Would they catch him? Would he ever come back? Finally, we got word that he had made it to Canada. And little Annie, She was devastated. She even wrote him a letter. And she told him how those, and she called them, those mean men hung Mr. Brown. And as a child, she also added that she was learning how to speak German. And the next letter that she write would be in German. But you know, I began to notice that she was not her usual self. It appeared as if her health was failing. And when the doctor came, and it wasn't much that he could do, and as time went on, you know, as a parent, you are very, very frightened. And then March 1860, God called my little one home. And I must say, my life changed forever on that day. And I recall as we brought her here to lay her to rest. We didn't have a plot, but you know, God is good. Because our friend, the Porters, said you can lay her in our family plot until Frederick come. And that's what I did, because I didn't have time to mourn. Frederick was gone. It was my job to take care of the family. And as we entered the cemetery, the one thing that came to my mind was how she and her father would take strolls in the cemetery. And I looked over my shoulder and I saw all these carriages coming to honor our child. And 12 years after Annie was called home to be with the Lord, our home was burned down. Again, Frederick was doing his job. He was away in Washington making the speeches on behalf of our people. Because you must remember, we are partners. We're partners in the struggle. And we had to hurry up and save Frederick papers, and Rosetta and her family was there, and we had to get the children and make sure that they're safe. And some of our friends allowed us to stay in there with them. The Porters, they allowed us to stay in their home until Frederick came. And as we stood there looking at our home, smoldering, smoke still coming. It was a very, very hard thing to do. And Frederick was already in Washington, so we moved to Washington. You know, friends wanted us to rebuild, and we almost rebuilt. But a year later, we decided that we would sell. And Frederick wrote a letter to one of his friends and asked him to sell the property. And thus began another chapter of our lives together. I am so sorry. I have another engagement to attend. And I have to say that I am very, very pleased, as I said, that you requested me to be here today. However, there is one thing that I would request of you, and I'm absolutely sure you would be great at doing that, is that as you live your life, travel, you will hear many speeches of Frederick. And as you should, because Frederick is a great man. However, I would love for you to remind people, enlighten people, that me and Frederick, we are partners. Not only in marriage, but partners in the struggle. Thank you for inviting me.
So hard to follow up from our visitor. But I do consider it a privilege to be able to talk about Frederick Douglass and all the people we visited today. But this really is hallowed ground, and we're so fortunate to have him resting with us in Rochester. Anna gave us a good overview of their life together. I'll just make some highlights. From 1847 to 1872, Frederick Douglass ran the North Star newspaper out of Rochester. Of course, the reference being the North Star was the guiding light of enslaved people escaping north. A lot of people don't realize that there was a substantial readership, not only among white citizens, but there was about 4,000 readers across the United States, West Indies, and Europe of the North Star at its height. Often people ask why there are two monuments here for Frederick. This was the original family monument that the family had put in place. And then I think subsequent to his death, when going through some property records of the plantation where he had been enslaved, they noted that his birth dates were wrong. And so a new monument was placed, and then this is his second wife, Helen Pitts Douglass, but our two newest additions here are, as you heard the story just now, a proper monument for Anna Murray Douglass and for their daughter Annie. Frederick was a self-educated orator. If you have never read his autobiography, it's a very easy read. It's available online, and it was one of the first glimpses that people had, that white people had, into an enslaved person's life. And this included things like you didn't know when your birthday was, you didn't know who your family was, or where they were from, or their name. Often when people once liberated from slavery would take the name of their former enslaver. So the autobiography I would recommend very highly. And as noted, he lectured throughout the U.S., Ireland, Scotland, and England to audiences of up to 3,000 people. In fact, it's interesting, in Ireland there are several monuments to Frederick Douglass in Ireland for his stay over there. I would invite anybody who wants to make any other comments to do so. My comments will just end with the fact that Frederick Douglass also was the first statue of a black man in the United States. And this statue was dedicated by Governor Theodore Roosevelt in 1899 downtown. It was subsequently moved to Highland Bowl, which was kind of ironic because that property actually had been owned by the man responsible for having his daughter Rosetta educated in a separate room from the white girls at her school. Eventually, one of our local activists, Reverend Julius Jackson Jr., he and others championed moving the statue to where it is now on South Avenue, a lot more prominent rather than in the Bowl property. Also, you may see a lot of replicas of that statue. That there was a charitable program a couple of years ago where a number of these statues were cast and placed in various places around Rochester, so you might also see them in your travels around our city. Does anyone want to make any comments based on?
Frederick Douglass, I just recently learned this, but in his speech Composite Identity, he talks a lot about pro-immigration, Asian American, China, Japanese laborers. So Frederick Douglass advocated a lot for immigrant rights, and particularly immigrants from Asian America. Asian Americans. So he has a big dealing with that. And last thing, there's 3 bills in the New York State legislative right now. One to expand Asian American education, LGBTQ, and also African American education to encompass more history that includes factors like that.
I mean, I knew that he was an advocate, but that's some really specific info. Other comments? Doug?
Yes, Frederick Douglass, of course, orated all over the place, but particularly in Farmington several times, which was a very abolitionist-oriented community. And Douglass wrote a letter to William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, which was published, saying that when he first spoke in Farmington, people were kind of lukewarm about what he had to say, but just very recently, they were very thoroughly excited and supportive of his cause. And so that's one of the claims to fame, if you will, of the 1816 Meeting House was Frederick Douglass orating there to a very receptive audience.
Well, that's a great point. And when I lived out in Macedon, the Baptist church there, Frederick Douglass also spoke at that church. And the brother of the man that built the house I lived in wrote this great obituary to Douglass in 1895, talking about seeing him speak at the Baptist church in Macedon. And again, when you have those eyewitness accounts, that's why I've really started to move more toward reading from the original material, because it's just great to be, remove a filter.
And so our plan, once the restoration of the 1816 building is complete, to have an actor or possibly a hologram of Frederick Douglass's oration right in the original building where he spoke.
All right, we're going to make our way back to where we started, but I have a couple of stops where I'll make some additional comments about some folks that are also buried at Mount Hope, but out of our scope. So there's one more resident here at the very, very end, and his name is Thomas James. And Thomas James has a very nondescript monument, but his contributions around abolition were just incredible. He actually also in the 1870s, I believe, wrote an autobiography that's also available online called The Life of Reverend Thomas James by himself. But he was born an enslaved person, and that's where he got the name Tom. Though later, as he was free, he changed his name to officially Thomas James. He was born in 1804 in Kanajahari, New York, which is by Cooperstown, and his master sold his mother, brother, and sister away when James was only 8 years old. Eventually, he was reunited with one brother, but he never saw his sister or mother again and had no idea about his father. He was sold several other times, and he finally fled to Canada. And he traveled, we know thanks to the autobiography, he traveled using the Underground Railroad, quote, slanted stake line along the canal to Lockport. And he noted that he was treated very kindly by the canal workers and the farmers. In 1823, he came to Rochester, and as mentioned, slavery was outlawed in 1827. He found work, he learned to read, and he became a minister at the AME Zion Church. He also, one of the things he did as a profession was teach, so he taught a lot of African American children, and then he started a lot of activism in terms of setting up anti-slavery events and meetings. that evolved into the Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. He also helped to buy a printing press to print The Rights of Man, which was a constitution and bylaws of his Anti-Slavery Society. After the publication of that, The Rights, he was arrested, and he was, quoting him, subjected to a mock trial with the object of scaring me into flight from the place, unquote. Undaunted, he remained in Rochester, giving speeches for his society and the surrounding area. In 1830, he built a wooden structure, the AME Zion Church, at Favor and Spring Streets. That church still stands. There is still a church at that site, but that's actually the third church. I believe that one dates from 1907. The congregation has moved over to Clarissa Street in a lot more modern building. And as part of that build in 1907, there were memorial windows created and input of Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, and Harriet Tubman. And the Tubman and Anthony windows are still visible at the new Congregation's Church, where the Meeting House had an event a couple months ago on Clarissa. The North Star was actually, before it went to the Tallman Building, Douglass edited and published it out of the AME Zion Church basement. In 1835, he leaves Rochester to preach in Syracuse. He built the congregation from about 20 participants to more than 80. At that time, the largest black congregation in Syracuse, pre-Civil War, and many of those members were active in the Underground Railroad. He was then reassigned to Ithaca, New York, Sag Harbor, Long Island, New Bedford, Massachusetts. Everywhere he was assigned to preach, he founded or joined anti-slavery movements at each location. Now, when he was in Massachusetts, he actually challenged the law of segregating passenger trains and won against this in the state Supreme Court of Massachusetts. He was also, some of you may be familiar with the Amistad case, the ship. He was involved in preparing and working on that project. Also importantly, in New Bedford, he met Frederick Douglass. He ordained him as a minister in that church, and that was the first opportunity that Frederick Douglass had to speak on slavery to a white audience. He also had, again, just monumental projects. During the Civil War, he assisted in liberating hundreds of enslaved from prisons and slave pens where they were encompassed down south. And again, just has a very, very simple marker in his memory in light of all that contribution. Does anybody want to add anything?
And where's the marker?
It's at the very end of the cemetery in the last section right by Elmwood.
Oh, so you want to walk there?
Right.
I think I just want to add that it was very hard for slaves to find a way to learn to read and write. And once they learned to read and write, what they could do with it, but there's 4 people that were fugitive slaves that lived in Rochester that not only learned to read and write, but wrote their autobiographies. And you mentioned Thomas James is one, Frederick Douglass is the other one, Austin Stewart is the other one, and Harriet Jacobs is the other one. So we have that.
Which is the person that Erica referenced.
Yes, Harriet Jacobs, yeah.
And Douglass's oldest daughter is buried out past toward that direction too.
Yes, Rosetta is buried at that end a little bit more to the side.
No car coming here.
And before Austin Stewart came to Rochester, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Before Austin Stewart came to Rochester to be Rochester's first black businessman, he lived in Farmington. During the time the 1860 Meeting House was constructed, we don't know whether he participated in that. He ended up being buried in Canandaigua.
Yeah, he's buried in Canandaigua. Yeah. So I just want to read a couple more things for perspective. So Frederick Douglass gave a speech at the Cooper Institute in New York in 1863 after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And if you haven't read Douglas's writings and orations, it's just beautiful language. So he said, I hail it as the doom of slavery in all the states. I hail it as the end of all that miserable statesmanship which has for 60 years juggled and deceived the people by professing to reconcile what is irreconcilable. We are all liberated by this proclamation. Everybody's liberated. The white man is liberated. The black man is liberated. The brave men now fighting the battles of their country against rebels and traitors are now liberated and may strike with all their might, even if they do hurt the rebels at their most sensitive point. I congratulate you upon this amazing change, the amazing approximation toward the sacred truth of human liberty. I'd also like to read from the Rochester paper when the end of the Civil War was announced. Citizens left their beds by the thousands and flocked together in the streets, congregating mostly near the intersection of Buffalo and State Streets, which is West Main, where they were advised that Lee had surrendered and the prospect was a speedy peace. The announcement was hailed with cheers, and cheer upon cheer followed for hours. Meanwhile, bonfires began to blaze in the streets and rockets rent the air. Guns and pistols, everything that would make a noise, was brought out and put into requisition. For the want of other material, a barrel of kerosene or refined petroleum was burned at the corner of State and Buffalo Streets and made a brilliant bonfire. And then I'll close with Thomas James, 20 years after emancipation, was asked for his comments. You ask me what change for the better was taken place in the condition of the colored people of this locality in my day. I answer that the anti-slavery agitation developed an active and generous sympathy for the free colored men of the North, as well as for his brother in bondage. We felt the good effect of that sympathy and the aid and encouragement which accompanied it. But now that the end of the anti-slavery agitation has been fully accomplished, our white friends are inclined to leave us to our own resources, overlooking the fact that social prejudices will close the trades against our youth, and that we are again as isolated as we were in the days before the wrongs of our race touched the heart of the American people. After breathing for so considerable a period an atmosphere surcharged with sympathy for our race, we feel more keenly the current of neglect which seems to have chilled against us even the enlightened and religious classes of the communities among which we live, but of which we cannot truly call ourselves a part. And to your point, someone who educated himself. So, well, it's been a real privilege to lead you on this tour today. I'm delighted to see so many of you weathering the rain. And is there anything else that anyone would like to add or question before we start our final haul? Is anyone looking for the grave of Susan B. Anthony? If you are, just pull me over and I'll tell you where it is.
We should also mention the 1816 Farmington Quaker Meeting House has a wonderful website that will keep you up to date not only on the project but also on the speaker programs. And Judy, what's the exact web address?
www.farmingtonmeetinghouse.org. And Demian, our videographer, will prepare a video presentation. It'll be on YouTube and also on our website. So if you'd like to go through what Sally just said as a wonderful, wonderful presentation, thank you so much, Sally. That was just super.
That was exciting.
I will add one thing, because we've obviously talked a lot about Frederick Douglass, and I will say that yes, you can go look at his speeches and you can read his words, and they are profound in so many ways, but I will encourage you to live those words, not just read them, because that's what he wanted. He didn't say it just for to be a wordsmith. He said it because he wanted people to be touched and for their spirit to be turned over to see humanity the way that he saw it, in spite of his circumstances. So to quote him, I would say that once you read him, you should unite with anyone to do right and with no one to do wrong.